Good afternoon, Bill. Good afternoon, Christopher.
The golden boy of Australian business. Picture this. It's in the 1980s in Australia, and every night, one man's face dominates the evening news. His name? Christopher Skase. With a charming smile and an air of invincibility, Skase embodied the glitz and glamour of the decade. But behind that facade lay a tale of ambition, greed, and ultimate downfall that would captivate a nation for years to come. Born in 1948 to radio star Charles Skase, young Chris seemed destined for greatness. The allure of big finance and even bigger money called to him from an early age. As a stockbroker and financial journalist, he cut his teeth in the world of high finance, learning the ins and outs of the system he would soon manipulate to his advantage. In the 1980s, Skase and three friends pulled together a modest sum of $15,000 to start a company called Team Security. Little did anyone know that this small venture would be the seed of an empire that would soon stretch across the Australian business landscape. Renamed Quintext and later Quintex Entertainment, Skase's company grew at a dizzying pace. What started as a retail business soon expanded to car dealerships, property development, and beyond. Skase had a golden touch, and everything he involved himself in seemed to turn to profit. By 1984, Quintex had grown so large that it was able to purchase Channel 7, one of Australia's four major TV networks. For those unfamiliar with Australian media, these would be akin to buying CNN or Fox News in the United States. It was a move that cemented Skase's position as a major player in the Australian business world. But Skase wasn't content to stop there. He expanded to luxury resorts, creating Mirage Resorts, a name that would prove ironically prophetic in the years to come. He even bought the Brisbane Bears, a local Australian football league team, further endearing himself to the public. At its peak, Quintex was valued at an astonishing 1.45 billion Australian dollars, equivalent to about $1 billion US dollars. Skase had become the golden boy of Australian business, a self-made man who seemed to have the Midas touch. Little did anyone suspect that this golden empire was built on foundations of sand, soon to be washed away by the tides of economic change and personal hubris. As Skase's wealth grew, so did his appetite for luxury and extravagance. His 40th birthday party became the stuff of legend, with a price tag of 180,000 Australian dollars in today's money. It was a lavish affair that showcased just how far the boy from Melbourne had come. But the party was just beginning. Skase's lifestyle was a testament to the excess of the 1980s. He owned a private jet, allowing him to jet across the country and around the world at a moment's notice. His yacht was an envy of the Australian coast, a floating palace that symbolized his meteoric rise to the top. Perhaps the most outrageous and unverified story of Skase's extravagance involved his wife, Pixie. As the tale goes, Pixie once forgot her favorite dress for a party in North Queensland. Instead of simply wearing something else, Skase chartered a plane to fly across the entire continent just to fetch the garment. Whether true or not, the story perfectly encapsulates the public perception of Skase's lifestyle, one of unrestrained opulence and disregard for financial constraints. Skase and Pixie became fixtures of Australian high society. They threw lavish parties, rubbed shoulders with the elite, and seemed to live a life plucked straight out of the pages of a glossy magazine. Their home was a palace, their wardrobes filled with designer clothes, and their lives a constant whirlwind of luxury and indulgence. To the public, Skase appeared to be living the Australian dream writ large. To the public, Skase appeared to be living the Australian dream writ large. He was the local boy, made good and self-made millionaire who had conquered the business world through sheer determination and business acumen, a beacon of what was possible in the land of opportunity. But with all things that seemed too good to be true, cracks were beginning to form in the facade of Skase's perfect life. The excesses that had once seemed like just rewards for his success would soon be viewed in a different light, as the actions of a man drunk on his own success and blind to the realities of the business world. As the 1980s drew to a close, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. The good times couldn't last forever, and for Christopher Skase, the party was about to come to a spectacular and very public end. As the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, the economic landscape began to shift beneath Christopher Skase's feet. The very factors that had allowed his meteoric rise now conspired to bring about his downfall. It was a perfect storm of economic challenges that would test the foundations of the Quintex empire. First came the rise in interest rates. The cheap money that had fueled Skase's rapid expansion suddenly became more expensive. Loans that had once seemed manageable now loomed large, threatening to choke the life out of his over-leveraged empire. Next, a global stock market crash sent shockwaves through the business world. The value of Quintex's assets plummeted overnight, leaving the company exposed and vulnerable. The paper wealth that Skase had accumulated began to evaporate, revealing the precarious nature of his financial empire. To compound matters, a pilot strike dealt a severe blow to Skase's luxury resorts. The Mirage resorts, once a crown jewel in the Quintex portfolio, saw bookings dry up as tourists found themselves unable to reach their idyllic destinations. The irony of the name Mirage was not lost on observers as the resort's profitability began to shimmer and fade like a desert illusion. Yet, in the face of these challenges, Skase made a fateful decision. Rather than retrench and consolidate, he chose to double down on his strategy of rapid expansion. It was a gamble that would prove to be his undoing. In 1989, Skase flew to the United States with grand ambitions. His target, the legendary MGM movie studios. It was to be the crowning achievement of his empire, a move that would catapult Quintex onto the global stage. MGM was willing to sell, but there was a problem. Skase's finance application was rejected due to excessive debt. One of Quintex's subsidiaries in the US filed for bankruptcy. It was like watching the first domino fall in an elaborate setup, and everyone knew what was coming next. Back to Australia, Skase's relationship with his own board of directors began to deteriorate. In a move that reeked of desperation, Skase attempted to force Quintex to buy one of his private businesses for $13.5 million. The board, perhaps sensing the writing on the wall, rejected the proposal. Undeterred, Skase went ahead with the transaction without the board approval, a move that would come back to haunt him. Alarmed by Skase's rogue action, the Quintex board reported him to the Australia Securities Commission. It was a shocking turn of events. The golden boy of Australian business was now being investigated by the very regulatory bodies that he once charmed. The Australian Stock Exchange, sensing trouble, requested proof of Quintex's financial wealth. When the company failed to provide satisfactory evidence, the ASX took the drastic step of suspending Quintex's shares. The house of cards was wobbling and the whole country watched with bated breath to see if it would come crashing down. Just 1 month after the suspension of Quintex's shares, the unthinkable happened. The company that had once valued at over $1 billion went into receivership, crashing under the weight of $1.5 billion in debt. It sent shockwaves through the Australian financial system. The Commonwealth Bank, which held the majority of Quintex's loans, moved swiftly to appoint a receiver. The task was clear: sell off Skase's assets and recoup as much money as possible. The fire sale began in earnest, with the once priced Mirage resorts being snapped up by a Japanese company at a fraction of their perceived value. Channel 7, the television network that had been the jewel of Skase's media crown, was also put on the chopping block. As it changed hands, a new chapter in the Skase saga began. The journalists who had once worked under Skase's reign now had an axe to grind. They turned their investigative skills towards their former boss with a vengeance. The collapse of Quintex had far-reaching consequences beyond just Skase and his immediate inner circle. The Victorian State Bank, which had lent heavily to Quintex, found itself in dire straits. Unable to weather the storm of bad debt, the bank was forced to declare bankruptcy. It was a stark reminder of how interconnected the financial world had become, and now the actions of one man could have ripple effects throughout the entire system. In 1991, the Quintex empire was no more. All that remained were mountains of debt and a host of angry creditors. Skase himself was left with a personal liability of $89 million. The man who had once seemed to have the Midas touch now found that everything he touched turned to dust. But even as his empire crumbled around him, Skase seemed unable to let go of the lifestyle to which he had become accustomed. In a move that would further enrage his creditors and the Australian public, Skase and his executives paid themselves hefty management fees in the dying days of Quintex. It was a brazen act, and one that was patently illegal. The authorities finally moved in. Skase was arrested, but in a twist that would set the tone for the years to come, he was released the next morning. The conditions of his release were clear. He was not to leave town. It was a command that Skase would promptly ignore, setting in motion the next chapter of his saga. As the news of Skase's action spread, public opinion turned sharply against him. The man who had once been hailed as a business genius was now vilified as a corporate criminal. The lavish lifestyle that had once inspired admiration now fueled resentment. Australians who had lost their savings, their jobs, or their businesses due to Quintex's collapse watched in disbelief as Skase seemed to escape the consequences of his actions. Little did they know that this was just the beginning of a cat-and-mouse game that would captivate and infuriate the nation for years to come. As the dust settled on the collapse of Quintex, Christopher Skase made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He fled Australia, ignoring the conditions of his release, and with creditors and authorities closing in, Skase boarded a plane and disappeared into the Northern Hemisphere. His destination? Spain, specifically the island of Mallorca, a Mediterranean paradise that would become Skase's refuge and prison for the next decade. As news of his flight reached Australia, the public reaction was one of outrage and disbelief. Here was a man who had brought financial ruin to countless Australians, now living in comfort on a sun-drenched Spanish island. The Australian government, caught flat-footed by Skase's escape, took until 1994 to formally place criminal charges against him. By then, Skase had already established himself in his new home, living a life that, while not as opulent as his Quintex days, was still far more comfortable than many of his victims could afford. But life in exile is not without its challenges. Skase developed terminal emphysema, a condition that would play a crucial role in his effort to avoid extradition. During a trip to Switzerland for medical treatment, specialists confirmed what Skase had been claiming all along, that it was unsafe for him to fly back to Australia due to his medical condition. Meanwhile, in Australia, the Skase family lived in constant fear. Death threats poured in from angry Australians who had lost everything in the Quintex collapse. The family became pariahs, symbols of corporate greed and the excesses of the 1980s. Channel 7, the very network Skase had once owned, now turned its cameras on him. Footage of Skase living in Spain was broadcast across Australia, fueling public outrage. The contrast between Skase's comfortable exile and the struggles of those he had left behind was stark and infuriating to many Australians. The public fear reached such a fever pitch that it spawned one of the most bizarre chapters in the Skase saga. Travel personality Andrew Denton captured the mood of the nation, organizing a public subscription to hire a bounty hunter to kidnap Skase. It was a plan that sounded more like the plot of a Hollywood movie than a real-life event. But it perfectly encapsulated the extreme anger many Australians felt towards Skase. As the 1990s wore on, the game of cat and mouse between Skase and the Australian authorities continued, with each side making moves and counter-moves in a high-stakes Lego chess game. As the new millennium dawned, Christopher Skase's health continued to deteriorate. The man who had once stood at the pinnacle of Australian business now found himself fighting for his very survival. His emphysema had worsened and he had developed stomach cancer. The high-flying lifestyle of the 1980s seemed like a distant memory as Skase struggled with his failing health. In a last-ditch effort to evade extradition, Skase and his family made a desperate move. They renounced their Australian citizenship and became citizens of Dominica, a small Caribbean nation. It was a clever ploy, but one that ultimately failed. Unbeknownst to Skase, Dominica had an extradition treaty with Australia, leaving him just as vulnerable as before. The net was closing in. Spanish authorities, under pressure from Australia, finally took action. He was arrested and imprisoned in Spain. The man who had once owned luxury resorts now found himself in a Spanish jail cell, his health failing and his options running out. As Skase's condition worsened, the tragedy of the situation began to dawn on many observers. Here was a man who had once had it all. The black and white narrative of Skase as the villain began to give way to a more nuanced understanding of a flawed man who had flown too close to the sun. On August 5, 2001, Christopher Skase breathed his last. He died in Mallorca, the island that had once been his refuge and his prison for over a decade. The news of his death was met with a mix of emotions in Australia. Some felt that justice had just been cheated, that Skase had escaped his day of reckoning. Others felt a sense of closure with a dark chapter in Australian business history. Others felt a sense of closure that a dark chapter in Australian business history had finally come to an end. With a final twist of irony, it was revealed that if Skase had returned to Australia, he would have been freed after paying a fine of just $90,000. The years of legal battles, the millions spent trying to extradite him, the public outrage, and all of it had been for naught. Skase had already served time in a Spanish prison, which would have counted towards any sentence he would have received in Australia. The revelation was a bitter pill for many Australians to swallow. The government had spent vast sums of public money in its pursuit of Skase, only to find that the ultimate penalty would have been relatively minor. It was a sobering reminder of the often messy and unsatisfactory nature of justice in the real world. Please subscribe below, and also don't forget to hit the bell icon so that you can be notified when we release new videos like this.